Smashing. Thank you very much, Mitch. Yep, so my name is Ben Saunders. I work for Wessex Archaeology in Scotland in our Edinburgh office. Last week, I gave a talk on the mapping the maritime heritage of the Firth project that we've been doing for the last 9 months or so, and that has a few more months still to run. And then I thought I'd do a follow-up session about going into a bit more depth about the history of navigation within the Firth of Forth, history of navigation more generally, as I thought it might be of particular interest to paddlers within the Forth, because it's interesting to see how you tend to use a variety of different techniques that other mariners have used for thousands of years, and it's a nice little connection between yourselves and past seafarers. So that's the plan for the evening. I'm not sure how long it will run. It's a bit of a cobble together of a few other workshops, but we'll see where we get to. First of all, we're going to go through a little bit of background to why navigation is important, how you navigate in general, and so how that changes over time, what variables there are that you need to think about as a mariner. Most of these will be familiar to you, but they're also just sort of getting up to the same sort of speed. So when you are voyaging out into the Forth or in general anywhere, there are a variety of different things that sort of you need to think about when you're working out how you're going to get somewhere and how you're going to get there safely. First of all, you need to think about what is propelling your vessel, how are you getting there? Are you able to row? Are you sailing? Do you have motor? Do you have paddles? What sort of direction can you take? Because obviously, when you're sailing, you can only go in certain directions depending on the wind direction. Whereas if you're motoring or paddling or rowing, you've got a bit more freedom, but also then potentially different construction and size to your vessels based on that. The other important one is what size is your vessel. You don't necessarily want to be going out into the wide open sea in a relatively small boat, although in the past people have done, possibly with far higher loss rates than would be acceptable now. But again, if you've got a large vessel, then you don't necessarily want to be coming too close to land, certainly not into areas where you've got shallows or mud banks or sandbanks, something like that you might ground on, you might damage your vessel. How experienced are you, both in terms of operating the vessel that you are operating, but also in terms of the area that you are working in, or the direction you're going in. If you're going into an area that you're brand new into, then you might want to spend a bit more. I might want to have more information if you can, or you might want to take on a pilot who knows the area far better. And also, how experienced are your crew? You don't necessarily want to be doing a transatlantic crossing with a brand new, inexperienced crew, but everyone has to start learning somewhere. So it's a bit of a start out for that. How far are you going, and what equipment do you need? Are you potentially going to have to overnight at sea? Are you going to try and do a coastal run where you come and stop close to shore overnight? Are you going to be sailing or voyaging, continuing that voyage during hours of darkness? What infrastructure is available to you? What is going to hopefully tell you where you are? And if you do go outside of land, how are you going to know where you are when you come back into sight of it? And indeed, what direction you're going in. And then what navigation tools are available to you? Do you have on board? Do you have access to a chart? Do you have access to a GPS in modern period? Do you have access to navigation tools such as sextants or compass roses? Or are you just purely doing it on the basis of your experience, your knowledge of the area, or indeed your lack of knowledge of the area? So these are all things you have to sort of start to keep in your head when you're starting out on a voyage. I'm sure all of you do in general. So yeah, if you think about prehistory and ongoingly still all the way through to now, oars and paddles have been a very important part of propulsion systems, particularly within shallow nearshore areas, but they're not necessarily something that you want to be spending your entire time using unless you're incredibly fit and happy to do 12, 15, 20 hours of rowing a day in offshore weathers and lumpy seas. People do it. People have done it, but you need to be set up for doing that. Similarly, as we said, sails, you can go in certain directions depending on the sail pattern, depending on the rig of your ship. Some ships will be far better with the following wind. Some ships will be able to tack and beat up towards windward, but very few, in fact, none can go straight into wind. So you have to think about how you're navigating and how you're able to escape as well, potentially. During the golden age of sail, ships were very concerned about being trapped against the lee shore. So that was with the shoreline being away from where the wind is coming from, towards where the wind is blowing, and potentially not allowing them to escape from embayments or other areas of trapping, which might lead to them wrecking on a coastline. Steam engines then come through, develop through during the 19th century, early 18th, 19th century. Initially driving paddles, and then eventually developing into propeller screw steamships. And then as we come into the 20th century, developing onto diesel and heavy fuel oil throughout much of the 20th century. And then in modern times, shifting towards electric motors and hybrid fuel systems as well. There's several ferries in Norway that are operating entirely on electricity. And I think there's a move towards more tugboats shifting towards it as well, because it's very good for large amounts of power at very little notice. So all of these things are going to affect how you think about your voyage and where you get there. Ship size, smaller vessels, much more manoeuvrable, as you all know, but also more vulnerable to wind, to sea conditions, waves, tidal currents, that sort of stuff. Potentially much more problematic in terms of large rollers from the Atlantic across, and also in a sort of sharp, short chop of the North Sea. Deeper draw, I don't know why I spelled depper, but I should say deeper. Draft means more stability to your vessel, but also brings more risk. You have large amount of water of ship in the water, and potentially you have the risk of isolated rocks, grounding, becoming embayed, all of these different problematic bits and bobs. Your differential hull construction can allow for grounding and deliberate drying out, particularly clinker-built vessels, so overlapping planks. Often those ships are designed to be beached and hauled out, and have all the bits of internal structure to enable them to do that without taking too much damage. As you get larger and larger vessels, particularly towards with the development of carvel vessels, they are less able to take the pressure of being out of the water. Their structural stability comes from having water resisting the hull from breaking apart, from sagging or hogging. And so you start to see a move away from ships being able to ground and dry out relatively happily. So again, all these things are going to change how you navigate, how you shift around within different parts of the sea. Your experience and your crew experience, if you think about before charts become common, and that's only really in the 19th century. Prior to that, they're very expensive, and they tend to only be for naval vessels and for some of the larger commercial fleets. Actually are more likely to be using pilotage or rutters, which are sort of descriptions of a route you're taking, usually looking at tidal variations, particularly within the North Sea. That's a very important consideration. And looking at landfall locations, sea marks, things you'll see along the way. Or indeed, knowledge of the local area, so whether that's a pilotage thing or you having operated in that area for a long time. You need to know where the tidal streams are if you're operating somewhere with tides, maybe not the Baltic and the Mediterranean, but certainly North Sea and North Atlantic and certainly the west coast of Scotland and the north coast have extremely powerful tidal streams, which can lead to you not being able to go through a tidal gate until it's going in the right direction, unless you want to be going in the wrong direction at speed. It's also helpful particularly when your boats start getting larger, to know where isolated hazards such as rocks and sand and mud banks are at different times of the tide, and how you recognise how to avoid those. Potentially, you also want to know where the landing points are and how you'd navigate safely into those. So we start to see development of pilotage systems, particularly within the Firth, relatively early optional pilot system within the Firth. It didn't become. I think it is now compulsory for pilots for larger vessels, particularly going up to places like Hound Point and that sort of stuff. But it was not. It was a voluntary system for much of the last 500 years, but people did take it on, even though the Firth is a relatively uncomplicated area. There are still enough hazards in there to cause potential issue. It's also important to have an understanding of local weather systems, whether that you are going to be in the lee of the land for quite some time and therefore not necessarily notice that the wind is getting up until you get a bit further out. Suddenly you're in much larger waves and much more difficult conditions. And also potentially you'll have to understand where wind shifts come from, where more complicated wave patterns are, potentially also overflows and these sort of other complex bits of current / tide bits are within the area. And that all comes from an understanding, potentially having been there before, or having a description written by someone who was there before, or having someone on board who is a pilot. You may also be thinking about, you need to think about the distance you're going. If you're just popping across from North Baddeck to Earlsferry, as many voyages were, particularly during the medieval period when they're carrying a large number of pilgrims going to St Andrews from northern England and southern Scotland, you can almost always, depending on whether the Haar's in or not, be within sight of land, whether that is within sight of North Baddeck or within sight of Earlsferry. Similarly, if you're just popping along from Dunbar, bumping along the coast to Leith to drop off an agricultural cargo or something like that, you're going to stay within the side of the coast, but also potentially a little bit further off just to make sure you're not going to actually crash into it. You may well be looking for landmarks or sea marks. Some of those may be natural, some of those may be man-made. Sometimes in areas where you haven't got obvious natural sea marks, you'll find that they relatively early on in history or prehistory, they do develop deliberate sea marks, whether that's a building with another function or a specific, we are building this because we need to have a point that you can see. And you also, to and from those, using those as your waypoints along the coast. As I say, often use of pilotage and rutters to give you information on tidal streams and the sea marks that you might see along the way. And these can be quite long. This rutter here takes you from, I think that one takes you from Hull down the east coast of England and across the Channel and into Rotterdam. And that's from roughly, I think about 1560. Or so, just to give an idea of this. And these are written down, handed out, and bought by shipmasters, merchants, to make sure that they are able to go to and from the areas they need to go to. Also worth having a look at what navigational infrastructure is in place. So whether that is, as we say, the natural landmarks, something like North Berwick Law, Largo Law are all important sea marks that you can line up with other things, whether that's Bass Rock or Fidra or one of the other islands in the Firth, to understand where you are and link yourself in to a known location. Often find that the ferries sailing between North Berwick and Earlsferry would be essentially lining themselves up on either Largo Law if they're going to Earlsferry, or to North Berwick Law if they're coming back to North Berwick. And that essentially gives you a really easy navigational point to see, provided that there's not Haar. You also think about the sea conditions, whether the tide's in and out, whether you need to be able to see where isolated rocks are. And over the course of particularly the second half of particularly from 1500 onwards, you start to see a development of land-based or isolated hazard markers coming through. The first lighthouse in Scotland is on the Isle of May in the Firth, and that's set up in the early to mid 17th century as a big coal burning beacon, with the family being put out there to be keepers of the light and make sure that it's illuminated as a hazard during times of darkness. You also see a network of local beacons and markers for hazards. The picture on the right there is an aerial view of rock cut sockets for timbers on a large rock within Torry Bay, just south of Torry Burn in Fife. And I think this is to do with navigating ships safely onto a quayside below the kirk there, which is for exporting coal from the coal mines up above, just to the east of Torry, in particular. And that's relatively early because those coal mines that infrastructure is not mapped in the 1850s. In fact, it's not put there at all. And there's a note saying that area isn't in use as an export location. That quayside isn't in use as an export location from about 1750 onwards. So this is presumably a wee bit earlier than that. Interesting that it is completely lost and unrecorded until the 1970s or so, when there's a big survey of harbours and other bits and bobs going through. Over the course of the 20th century, then you also see, 19th century and not 20th century onwards, you see the further development of navigational infrastructure through the development of lighthouses with the Northern Lighthouse Board, lightships as well, such as North Car, and then during the 20th century, the development of radio beacons and eventually direction finding coming through as well, to keep people safe. And it's all developments up in there to locate hazards, and more importantly, also locate the ships themselves, and allow them to find out where they are, all the way through to now when we have AIS and GPS as well. And yes, navigational instruments, what's available to you. The compass is a relatively late, much later than necessarily think, development. You can also navigate using a lead line and lead, a log. The log that gives you your speed and therefore how far you're traveling. The lead line that gives you the depth of water. Still useful within areas like the Forth because you can follow a contour along it, but obviously that changes with the tide. So you need to know how deep the tide is. But certainly in areas which are not tidal, such as the Baltic, some of the early navigation is done using a lead line. They go out to the 30-meter contour and then they follow it along east or west, using a mix of of where the sun is and the depth of water to be able to follow that along. You do get early charts. They're not great. National Library of Scotland has got a fantastic resource of charts of Scotland from, I think the earliest is about 1480. They are at that point quite small scale, and they're very, very hit or miss, really, all the way through to the development of modern hydrography in the 1750s, which we'll talk about in a little bit. You also have the development of stellar and lunar instruments. Backstaff, crossstaff, and sextant are all very important to navigation across the globe from the 15th, 16th, 17th century onwards. And the eventual development of hydrographic charts, very expensive at the start again, but becoming more accessible and cheaper throughout the 19th century into the 20th. And then we see the development of things like Decca systems off the back of World War II and radar, and positioning finding through that. And then during the late 20th century, the development of global navigation satellite systems, which have the US military system, the GPS system, Russian military system GLONASS, and the European system Galileo, and the Chinese also have a system called Baidu. Generally, your GPS will be able to connect to all of those. I don't think currently you can connect to GLONASS. A lot of organizations have removed that possibility due to the sanctions with the Ukrainian war. But it highlighted the fact that a lot of these are competing military systems that are being used for civil purposes, with really the Galileo one being one of the few civilian systems in place that doesn't have the potential to be turned off by a military being particularly grumpy at the time. So, if we think about the Forth in particular, and then where you're wanting to go, how you're getting around over the course of time, in prehistory, we're looking at functions for seafaring being inshore fishing, very local transport, potentially going from bay to bay or coast to coast, and moving small amounts of materials. You're looking at things like coracles, maybe some sown plank boats, log boats, these sort of style of vessels. Relatively small numbers of people and relatively small amounts, staying within sight of the coast unless something goes wrong, and also potentially deliberately making sure that they're going out in relatively favourable conditions, trying to avoid going out in anything that's going to cause an issue, particularly if you're in the Forth and your prevailing wind is southwest, and if something goes wrong, you're going to go to Norway, whether you want to be or not. Realistically, the majority of seafarers in the area would have a good idea of the local knowledge, a good local knowledge of the area, because they would have been operating in that area for a long time. And there's not really a lot of infrastructure. In fact, there's realistically almost no infrastructure as far as we're aware. You're using beach fronts as your launch points and landing points. There's no navigational infrastructure beyond what is there originally, what the natural features that you can see, and you have no real navigational aids beyond your own knowledge. So it's all very early, not particularly. It is complicated. That's unfair, but you haven't got the wide variety of features that you have later on. We then turn up. The Romans come along. They've got important bases at Cramond on the Almond to the west of Edinburgh, and also on the Esk, Inveresk in Musselburgh to the east of Edinburgh. Cramond is, and then also potentially, well, they definitely have bases on the Antonine Wall between Falkirk and the Clyde. So there's the eastern base of that on the River Carron. Larger wooden vessels, they are more seaworthy. They are able to go out and cross potentially just outside of land, but still staying relatively inshore. There, as you can see, there on the trireme on the galley on the upper right. They are rowed. They do also have some sail operation. Generally sailing in front of the wind with the following wind behind them. As a rule, the reason that Cramond is where it is and the reason that Inveresk is where it is because they're close to a river mouth, which are ideal for beaching your boats next to that, or indeed just tying up in the river mouth, and it gives you a decent amount of safety even in times of storms. It's not amazing. You have still got the potential of dragging anchors, losing your ship, but you're much safer than if you were just out in the middle of the Forth. And these ships are transporting material for the Roman military campaigns and for their infrastructure within southern Scotland and the Central Belt. The Roman army, when it is in Scotland, is generally using equipment at quite a rate and needs to be supported by a fleet of vessels rather than bringing everything up along the roads from northern England. They also do have extensive trading networks, even with areas that they are not in control of. So you have extensive evidence for Roman trading operations all the way up into Orkney and Shetland with the Iron Age groups in these areas. Port Mahomac and Cromarty Firth again, very important for glass manufacture and other luxury items, interestingly. And also potentially for supplying of mercenaries and auxiliaries to the Roman army at various times. So they are operating all over the Scottish, both west and eastern seaboards, in a variety of different functions, but they are generally staying quite close to shore, operating during the day and using river mouths as their stopover points. So we move forward in time. During the early medieval period, you have these perfect boats, the Viking long ships and other style vessels, ideal for being beached. You do find that, particularly as we know, that the Norse and the Danes did go to places like the Faroes, Greenland, and America. They are able to operate outside of land, and that's largely using their knowledge of sea conditions, wind patterns, and potentially a thing called a sunstone, which may allow to identification of where the sun is at various times of day, to basically allow you to understand which way is east and west and where you're looking to head to. And what I generally do is try and follow a line of latitude along, leaving from a certain place and just trying to head as direct west or east as they can. Again, the majority of this will be under oar or sail power. Ideally, they're going to sail as much as possible to not exhaust themselves, but they will use oars as needed. Not entirely sure how that ship is moving within that picture, because the sail's down and there's no oars. There's just some cows and horses which don't appear to have oars with them, but they are. It's a little just demonstration of what those ships might have looked like. Again, localish transport, but you are still getting more crossing of the North Sea, and indeed more crossing of the North Atlantic as well. At this point, you're generally looking at sheltered natural harbours. You might have a development of some piers and jetties. You do certainly have that from the Roman period as well. The extensive jetties and piers in places like London are a good demonstration of the need for more complex port infrastructure during the Roman period and later on. But generally, places like Aldham, Coldringham have a small sheltered harbour. Usually on the east coast, it's sort of tucked round on the west side of a settlement with an opening to the north, allowing the vessels to come into a sheltered bay and pull up onto the strand there. You also have to see the same thing at Bamborough in Northumberland and at Port Mahomack in Cromarty as well. During the medieval period, you do still see the use of tidal flats, beaching ships for trade. This is the point at which you're starting to move away from clinker-built vessels with the overlapping planks to more carvel vessels, so where they have the planks edge to edge on a relatively smooth side. Those can still be beached, but you need to make sure they tend to be the ones that do get beached more regularly tend to be smaller, more heavily built, and usually want to be beached on relatively soft and relatively flat material. A lot of these are being used for trade. The trading networks that are developing within the medieval Firth are extensive. You have connections to all over the Baltic, all over the North Sea basin, down to England, and starting to see trade looking at going a bit further afield as well. Start to see the beginnings of a navigation system, certainly within other areas such as the Thames. You see a navigation system coming in around this period. We're using different coloured withies to mark channels or to mark shallows within other areas. And you see the start of this in the Firth as well, starting to get to guide ships across those between the sandbanks and between the areas of other possible hazard. Again, we discussed the early navigation system instruments and use potentially depending on the size of your vessel and how well kitted out it is, how well kitted you are as a vessel master. You may well have cross staffs, backstaffs, sextants, these sort of things to sort of give you an idea of where you are for latitude. And then for longitude, that's not sorted out in terms of discovering that until the 18th century and the work done by majority the Royal Navy and organisations down in London. Ship size does again begin to increase. You're safer. You've got more resilience against complex weather systems, difficult sea states, but you also, as we've said, have more of a risk from submerged subsea dangers, isolated rocks, sandbanks, these sort of things, and you start to see harbours develop because these ships can't be beached, can't be allowed to dry out as often, and also it's more efficient to load and unload. So you start to see the development of navigational elements to enabling ships to get to and from in and out of a harbour, projecting out into the sea in the Forth. These are just some examples of that thing from Torry Burn. So that orange dot there is the where the beacon rock is. That's the remains of a pier, which is pre-1750, because the notes for this pier say that this was built around 1750 to replace this one. This is the little wharf that I think was built at the same time as all of these things. And then these are 5 setting points probably for wooden posts, marking the southern point of that little channel there that enables the vessels to come in. There'll presumably be something at the end of this pier to warn people as well. Come in this side, follow along those markers, and then moor up on that little jetty there. Over the course of the medieval period, harbours start to develop, particularly Leith, Burnt Island. The example in the bottom corner there is at Muirhouse, between New Haven and Cramond. Looks really good from above. If you go there and have a wander around at low tide, it is difficult to see. But you have got this one arm of a breakwater coming around here, the probable entrance to the harbour here. And then this is very sketchy, but you can sort of see the edge of the rocks there, the breakwater wall there. No idea what date that harbour is, other than it probably predates 1750 again. It's not on Roy's map of the Lowlands. It's not on the first edition map in 1850 odd for that area of Edinburgh. But interesting that it's there, and it is a relatively sizable investment to make even a relatively small tidal harbour in this point. The tidal flats at that point in the Forth do go out quite a long way, so this would only be operational during high tides. Ships would come in, moor up, the tide would go away, and they'd be left high and dry, being loaded or unloaded, ready for the next high tide to leave. And that's what we see across the Forth, a wide variety of different harbours being developed at this point, both in royal burghs. I think I might talk about royal burghs in a little bit, and also in burghs of barony, so burghs that do not have the right to trade internationally, whereas a royal burgh has a license from the king or queen to trade internationally and pays taxes based on that. Leith is not a royal burgh, but it is the official harbour of the Royal Borough of Edinburgh, and therefore develops quite extensively. You have 2 harbours in Leith: the Royal Harbour and the Town Harbour on around the King's Walk and this sort of area, and then before this drawbridge comes in, the Abbey Harbour back towards this area here, and then slowly developing. You see these dry docks coming in. Shipbuilding in this area is continuous from about 1500, I believe, maybe a wee bit earlier than that. There's also shipbuilding here, which is where Customs House now is, and the development of some elements of piers to try to push out into the Forth and make the approach to the harbour more accessible, remove some of the sandbanks. What essentially happens is every time they move the ends of the pier out, trying to force the water Leith to scour out the approaches to the harbour, a new sandbank develops off the end of it, and they have to try then end up shifting them further and further out until they're finally down to the well past the low tide. You do get some very large, some complex harbours coming through. Something like Caronshaw, halfway up the Carron, or some of the way up the Carron. Alloa, essentially using the entire Forth as its river frontage, is an important harbour during this period. And you also see the development of a royal dockyard at Erith and Higgins Nuke, where the Great Michael was built in Newhaven, but was operated for a short period. It was operated by Scotland out of Higgins Nuke / Erith on the south side of the Forth, basically the southern end of the Kincardine Bridge. So you do start to see some more complex infrastructure being developed at this point, which again would mean more complex infrastructure to associate with that to allow that easy navigation between places. You also start to see in some of these early charts the development of a hazard marker system. So there is a beacon off the end of the approaches to Leith and the Water Leith from fairly early on. That's actually also on Roy's map in the 1750s. Some of the earlier charts also demonstrate that. So probably from somewhere around 1500, 1600, there's some form of beacon off the end of the low tide extent of the Water Leith. Leith being one of the most important harbours and most busiest harbours in the area, it tends to get the infrastructure first. As we said, if you have the development of the lighthouse in the Isle of May in the 17th century, there is also a beacon put on the North Car off Fife Ness, and there is potential for other for evidence for other places, other beacons, other warning points to be identified. So that one at Torry Burn was identified before, but hasn't necessarily been mapped and recorded in the same extent. That model, that aerial image of it, is from a 3D model I made of it about 3 months ago. And there's a potential for lots of other ones on all the isolated rocks off other important harbours, or just other landing points that are taking vessels in and out of that don't want to lose those ships to hazards. So any of the isolated rocks along the North Fife coast between Inverkeithing and Aberdour may well have the remains of beacons on them. They may have they certainly do have the remains of some later beacons, because there are ones marked in the late 19th century. But whether they also have evidence for earlier beacons on is currently not known, because they're difficult to survey, essentially, unless you are paddling out around them. You do also see an early evidence for buoyage coming in. One of the charts in the mid 1700s, in 1745, there was a cost to Parliament for a buoy to go out off the Gunnet Rock west of Inchkeith. Part of that is because it's quite close to the roads for Leith Harbour, Leith roads, where ships sit, anchor, and wait for a space in the dock to come and unload or load. And so it's worth buoying it off, because it's clearly starting to cause some problems. There are clearly ships hitting it and having difficulties because of that. So it's the buoyage system is both a navigation system, but also sometimes you have buoys there for mooring systems as well. That image shows a iron buoy put in off Blackness Castle in the 1850s for powder barges, powder hulks, as part of naval operations within the Forth. You do get channel markers. We'll look at some of the examples of those later on. Hazard markers, and potentially also warping in and out buoys. So buoys that you tie a rope to, and then that rope goes back to the capstan on your vessel, and you warp your way in to a harbour or into a location to avoid having to sail in, or having to try and wait until the wind is in the right direction to allow you to sail in. And these all do start to develop from the mid 18th onwards. The birth of hydrography. So Orcadian Modo Mackenzie, who's a North Ronaldsy man, develops a series of instruments that are incredibly useful for making very accurate marine charts in around 1750. He celebrates this by charting some of the North Isles of Orkney as incredibly dangerous places to sail around, and eventually becomes the Scottish Hydrographer Royal. Goes around making charts of large amounts of the Scottish coast using these instruments. And in fact, some of the west coast of Scotland is still essentially based on his charting, because it was very, very accurate and very good. You start to see the standardization of notation within charts. You start to see the charts showing depth, and so people who are using those charts know what the depth should be, particularly for lead line work, and just for knowing where you might be at danger of grounding. And they are expensive. Sometimes you get charts being restricted on the basis of national security. Those restrictions last all the way through, in some cases, into the mid-20th century. You get a lot of charts which have just blank spaces where forts or military bases or dockyards are essentially saying, well, there may be something here, but you can't see it. But they are very expensive. You tend to only have them if you are either a wealthy shipmaster or navigator, or if you are carrying cargo. That basically means you can afford to have those charts rather than losing your ship. It's only really in the 19th century that they become more available, and to a wider selection of people. Some of those charts will have things like these examples on the right there, which is sort of illustrations showing transits between two or more points that say, if you can see these things and you keep these two things lined up, then you won't hit something else that's off the same line. This is particularly useful for ocean-going ships that are coming into the coast. They're deeper draft. They are potentially larger and more difficult to maneuver. And so you want to have an idea about where these sunken hazards are and how to avoid them easily by just keeping two things in a line. So you find a lot of these charts will have these little drawings around the edges of them, which essentially say, keep these two things lined up, or keep these two things off to starboard or to port, and that will see you right when you're going into, for instance, somewhere like Grangemouth for the bottom one over there. And I think that's something that I've certainly done when I've been paddling, is lining up two things and using that as a sight line to go in and out of places. Certainly something I've done when I've been sailing. And it enables you to have a better perception of the hazards around you and your place within them, particularly when you're close to shore or within a restricted sea room area. And you don't need to be able to read. You don't need to be able to read a chart at all. You just need to be able to look at a thing and say, oh yes, that looks like that. These are quite powerful sort of ways of democratizing navigation. You can also find, there's a series of lovely illustrations that parts of the Royal Navy made throughout the 18th and 19th century. A lot of the first, second, and third lieutenants were also artists, or had been trained by the Navy to be artists, and would go and do these drawings as navigational aids for people coming after them to basically say, this is what it looks like. If you can anchor here and everything's safe for you. The images also contain other clues. So this is a drawing of the Bass Rock and Tantallon Castle as part of the approaches to the Firth. And as you can see, the Bass Rock is covered in little drawings of seabirds. And that's so that people know that if they're going to go anywhere near the Bass Rock, they're going to hear large quantities of seabirds. And so you're using all your senses at this point to understand where you are. So even if it's a har, if you start to hear huge quantities of seabirds and you think you're somewhere near the Bass Rock, then you probably are somewhere near the Bass Rock. And these sort of things are all little tells that people can use wherever they are, whatever they're doing. As we sort of progress into the late 18th, early 19th century, you start to see man-made issues becoming a problem in navigation. Not just the larger number of vessels being used and the potentially quite restricted navigational channels that they are operating in. One of the issues within the Firth is a lot of the vessels are only carrying material for export from the Firth. A lot of that material is coal, particularly from the Fife and Lothian coalfields, and the Clackmannanshire coalfields as well. Or it's lime from places like Charleston, or stone from the quarries going to around places. But what it means is that they're not necessarily importing anything, but they still need to be weighed down. They still need to have some ballast in them for stability when they come. And then once you get to the Forth, you don't need that ballast anymore. You're about to fill up with coal. There is an ongoing problem, particularly going up into the upper Forth from sort of Grangemouth up, with vessel crews just dumping that material over the side as they approach places like Alloa. And while one boatload of ballast doesn't necessarily cause an issue, if you see the number of ships going in and out of Alloa in the early 19th century with coal is colossal. And so it starts to cause major issues. You start to essentially get ballast banks building up within the Forth, which are hazardous to navigation. They're causing issues for the Alloa Harbour Board. The Alloa pilots are having a great time because they go and find out where these things are, and then they're the only people who know where they are, so they're the only people who can get the ships safely up into Alloa. So in 1857, I believe, 1837, sorry, the Alloa Harbour Board get a Act of Parliament saying that no one is allowed to empty their ballast into the River Forth, and that if they do, they will be unable to land at Alloa and will be fined and potentially imprisoned based on that. At that point, you start to see deliberate ballast banks developing up at places like Inverkeithing, where ships are allowed to come in, dump their material on the coastline, partly because it's quite a useful building material to sort of reclaim land, and then they go up light from Inverkeithing to places like Alloa. So the north side of Inverkeithing Bay is almost entirely ballast from various vessels. There's also a big ballast mound at Kennet Pans, where the world's first commercial distillery was made by Haig brothers. And that ballast mound is unusually scheduled as an ancient monument. It's actually built up somewhere around 1750 with the operation of the distillery, and it's got quite a lot of Norwegian pottery in it, because a lot of the ships that come into Kennet Pans are Norwegian, and they're filling up with rock and rubbish from Norway and then offloading it onto the riverbank at Kennet Pans. But it's just a good example of how man-made activity starts to cause navigational issues as well. As we sort of gallop onwards into the 19th century, the advent of engines changes things completely. You no longer have the possibly, well, you do have the issue, but it's no longer quite as dangerous of getting embayed. These are two unfortunate ships desperately trying to get off a lee shore. There's the spar of another ship that hasn't managed to get off a lee shore. Incredibly dangerous for vessels because they just cannot get away due to the onshore wind pushing them back onto the shoreline. The advent of the engine means that actually you don't necessarily have to worry about that quite as much, because you can just steam straight in a line, provided there's nothing else you're going to hit. Initially, engines are quite unreliable. You see that vessels still have auxiliary sail rigs on them into the mid-19th century, even though the first steamship of its type is the Comet, built in 1819, 1820, I believe. But all the way through to the 1850s, 1860s, you still see a lot of ships not quite necessarily trusting the engines that they have, with good reason, and keeping an auxiliary sailing rig on as well. And it entirely changes the speed at which you can go. They're not necessarily always faster than sailing ships. If you look at the speed with which some of the China tea clippers are coming back in the late 19th century, but they are more reliable because you are able to go at 10 knots constantly, as opposed to go at 15 knots for a little bit and then the wind drops and you're doing nothing. And it also changes the courses you're going, so you don't necessarily need to worry too much about tacking or going based on where the wind is blowing from. You don't need to worry about predominant winds, you don't need to worry about prevailing winds, and you don't need to worry about necessarily as much about wind strength, up to a point. And so you start to have different types of voyages being used. And again, this leads to a great amount of shipping, and a great amount of navigational aids, because you start to have again, larger vessels coming in and out, more extensive industries, more ports, importing, exporting globally. So vessels coming from all over the world into the Forth. Vessels coming from all over the world with masters and crews that speak different languages, haven't necessarily been to the Forth before. So you start to see the development of more complicated navigational voyage systems. This chart is one of the almanacs of the Forth, which would have been available to people quite widely. It's actually the Forth and the Tay for this one. And these are published towards the tail end of the 19th century, start of the 20th century. You see, it's the voyage system is still not standardized. It's not the system we use now with red, green, and red for port, green for starboard, and the Ayala A type that everyone apart from America and somewhere else uses. You've got a wider sort of selection of different coloured buoys that are not, so there'll be different colours working down, and then they'll repeat them again on the basis that you're less likely to confuse Gunnet West and North Craig, for instance, in the red and white striped one. Larger ships, yes. So you need a different system of voyage to sort of think about those sort of things. You also have the development of more extensive lighthouse systems and harbour lights across the Forth. Again, harbours will have lights on the end of their piers potentially. Somewhere like Crail and other places had a harbour light that they would light if it was safe to come in, but they would keep unlit if it was not safe or if the tide did not suit. So essentially, you have a light and then that's all noted down in things like the almanac. And there's also flag systems in Leith and Granton and in the Tay to tell ships whether they are what the tidal state is, how much water is in the harbour, which will allow the ship to make a decision whether it comes in or not. There may well be not enough water in there for it to load and unload in time. So yeah, all becoming somewhat more complicated, certainly more complicated than in prehistory when you're going around in a logboat just bobbling on the coast. Coming out of World War II, development of radio beacon navigation within the not coming out of World War II, but the development of radio beacon navigation in the early 20th century actually has some of the earliest experiments in it done in the Forth, partly due to the fact that it's a major naval anchorage during World War I and World War II. You also then start to see the Decca navigation system of navigation using early computers onto both cargo and eventually onto fishing boats as well. The Scottish Fishing Museum in Anstruther holds a fantastic selection of fishing skippers' individual charts of the fishing grounds that are based off the Decca system, because it enables them to pinpoint where they are far more accurately and say, okay, I know where I can get fish. Obviously, those charts are then quite jealously held by the skippers because they want to be able to get the fish themselves. But some of them have donated those to the Scottish Fishing Museum once they retire, partly because very few people use Decca now, because it's outdated thanks to GPS. You do also find that during this period, you start to get the mapping of wrecks. So the UK Hydrographic Office starts to map wrecks during the Second World War because the sonar system that they're using to hunt submarines is also pinging off wrecks that are in the sea, in certain points in the sea, because they're metal as well. And so there's a massive effort during the Second World War to map as many wrecks as they can, so that they're not offering a false positive and telling people it could be a submarine, so that the submarine hunters can go and find these if they do get a ping back and it's in an area where there is definitely a wreck, they can say, okay, well, that might be a wreck. We'll leave that, or try and follow it and see if it is a submarine. If it's an area where they don't have any known wrecks. You also then start to get more wrecks being reported to the UK Hydrographic Office by fishing skippers based on the fact that they've lost their nets on a wreck, or it's become an area where there's seeing a lot of obstructions. And then the UKHO might go out and do a survey of that location and complete get something in to say there is a wreck there or there isn't. Decca's not fully, so it's not as accurate as GPS or something like that. So sometimes you'll have multiple Decca locations for an obstruction, which is the same obstruction but called in by different skippers. But still useful information as we go through that. And then finally, modern navigation, as we see now, whether that's electronic charts on more and more vessels, from large-scale tankers and cargo vessels all the way down to yachts, and potentially some of the small handheld electronic chart systems that you can also have on things like kayaks, or whether it's just a laminated chart of the area you're going to be paddling around in to see where you're going and make sure you have an idea of hazards and tidal flows and that sort of thing. Ships, again, getting bigger, you need deeper and deeper shipping channels to enable them to get in and out. This is an example of the Firth navigational charts from Forth ports, giving large vessels, particularly ones those going to Grangemouth, an idea of where to of how they navigate through the channels. You've got a mix of information about course corrections along their waypoints, what they need to do to say yes, I've passed these things, I've passed these things, who they're reporting to, and information about what speed limits and that sort of thing are. Elsewhere, you might have separation channels. Certainly in the English Channel around Dover, you have a separation channel where on the west side of the channel is where ships going north or east are, and on the south side of the channel, ships going south/west will be going that way. Also important to have things like information about radio contact, but there are still pilotage information in this. The Forth pilots do still operate out of Grantham. We did a session on the history of pilotage with the former harbour master of the Forth, Jimmy Simpson, a few months ago, which was absolutely fantastic, and looked at the development of the Forth Pilots Association over the course of the last 400 years, 500 years or so. Really interesting talk. I wish I'd recorded it, but it was in person, so it was all a bit complicated. But yes, and that's all based around ongoingly GNSS and AIS, the automatic identification systems, which ships should be using, and as we're not in a conflict zone, generally do use. Warships sometimes don't. But yeah, still an important use of transit, still an important use of local knowledge through the pilotage scheme. But more and more information is out there to enable people to get around safely, particularly when you think about it compared to many points in history where you're relying entirely on your own knowledge, your experience, and an element of good luck, particularly with the weather. And I think it's a point to make that the history of navigation at sea is it's an interesting one, but there was a lot more loss of life necessarily in the past because it was very, very risky. And the reason that we don't have quite the same level now is due to extensive safety methodologies, and down to people being sensible and getting that information they need from those sources before they go out. And I think that's a good. It can only be a good thing, because the sea is a dangerous place, as I'm sure you all are aware. And good navigation skills, good navigation information is really important, no matter what size of vessel you're using. I think this is my last slide. Yes, it was. So I think that's everything I have. I'm very happy to take any questions or have a chat about anything on that as is useful.
Yeah, sorry, thanks, Ben. Really appreciate that. So you're still sharing your screen. There we go. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much. And yeah, obviously the floor's open to anyone who wants to ask questions. feel free to raise your hand, or if you want to use the chat box as well. But really appreciate your time there. And I'll leave it for people. I'm going to stop recording for now if you're happy with that, Ben.
Yeah, no problem.